Good afternoon, and welcome to our coffee break webinar for special education leaders. The topic of today's coffee break is extended school year. And please know that the focus of this webinar today will be for those who lead special education programs in their LEAs. My name is Cecil Crouch, and I'm an educational consultant with the Patton Pittsburgh office. I'm talking to you today more from the lens of a special education administrator. I was in that role for the past 7 years in a large suburban school district in Western PA. And one of the first things that I needed to rework in that position was extended school year. We had far too many students being found eligible, and just from a mathematical standpoint, it really wasn't feasible that we would have that many students who needed extended school year to receive FAPE. In addition, the data collection and how ESY was provided wasn't very efficient, and so we had to re-examine the entire system and rebuild it. You may or may not be rebuilding your extended school year system, but regardless, I think you'll get something from today's discussion and resources that will help you build or just fine-tune extended school year in your LEA. There's a book on leadership by Michael Fullen, and it's titled Nuance: Why Some Leaders Succeed and Others Fail. And there's a quote in that book that says, "A key dimension of nuance is to be able to see the big picture, the system, while at the same time being able to understand the details and their connections and hidden patterns operating within the system itself." And our hope for this session today is just that, to help see the big picture, the system, while considering all of the details and their connections and patterns for the purpose of revisiting, revising, and/or rebuilding your extended school year processes. When you received your confirmation email for this webinar and then the reminder that was sent on December 4th, you received the link to join, and you also received the link to get the handouts for this session. And I want to take a few moments to show you how to get the handouts just to make sure that you all have access to them. On the screen, you should see the Patton website, and that would be step one. If you do not have the 3 handouts for today's session, go to the Patton website, which is www.patton.net. And in the upper left-hand corner, it says Training Calendar, and you click on Training Calendar, and it will default to December. And then once you are on the training calendar for December, you just scroll down to today's date, which is December 9th, and it's a pretty far ways down. So for December 9th, the only thing listed is the coffee breaks for special education leaders. So if you click on that, it'll bring you to this page. And on the right, it says Event Info, and the third box down says Event Files. And that's where you'll find the 3 handouts. The first handout, Extended School Year Services in Pennsylvania, which is one of the Patton publications. Handout 2, Implementing ESY Processes. And handout 3, ESY, a year at a glance. So we will be going over these handouts in order. So if you're able to pull up the first handout, Extended School Year Services in Pennsylvania, that's what we'll refer to first, and I will pull it up on my screen as well. Okay. So this publication, the reason we're going over it is because this was instrumental in helping me rebuild extended school year in my district, and I know in talking to a bunch of colleagues, they find this publication really helpful as well. In my district, I actually made sure that each special education teacher, each principal, each school psychologist, and each related service provider had a copy to ensure we were all coming from the same page. I'm not going to go into details in the publication because you have it and you can read it, but I do want to point out all of the good information so you know what's there. And so very briefly we'll go through this. On pages 2 and 3 are the federal and state regulations regarding extended school year, which is mainly information about eligibility criteria. It may be helpful for you as a special education administrator to know that on page 3, about the middle of the page, is where it talks about what extended school year is not. It's not provided due to a desire for daycare or respite. It's not provided due to a desire for a summer recreation program, and it's not provided due to a desire or need for other programs that, while they may provide educational benefit, are not required to ensure the provision of a free, appropriate public education. In other words, I would imagine most, if not all, students would benefit from ESY, but it's only required for the students who need it and are eligible to receive it. Then on pages 4 and 5, it's basically the same information. It is the regulations from Chapter 711, which is for charter and cyber charter schools. And then on pages 6 through 8, there's information for parents. So if you send information to your families in your school district or charter school about extended school year, this is a good resource to pull from. Then on pages 9 through 12, there's information intended as a guide for IEP teams. If you need to send out general information to your staff regarding the ESY eligibility determination process, this is good information to pull from. And especially helpful are pages 10 and 11 because they include examples about what is meant for each of the factors. And these examples are just that, they're examples, but it may help your teams form a more accurate conceptual understanding about eligibility. And then pages 13 through 15 contain the ESY section of the IEP. And so the first page, on page 13, this is just blank. This is just showing what the ESY section of the IEP looks like. Then on page 14, this is an example of what the completed section may look like for a student who is eligible for extended school year services. And then on page 15 is an example of what the completed section may look like for a student who is not eligible for extended school year services. And then pages 16 and 17 include an ESY checklist that you may want your IEP teams to use or at least be aware of. In my district, I had procedures for the teams to follow that were based on this publication. So if we got to February and a team was unsure if a child was eligible or not, we went through this checklist and it always seemed to help. It's a pretty good resource. And then pages 18 through 24 contain common questions and answers related to extended school year. And then the whole way down on page 25 are just some resources and references. So I believe this was a fabulous resource to me in a district that was revamping its extended school year services. It really helped a lot as we worked through all of the processes. And so please take some time to explore it and see if it would be helpful for you. So that, in a nutshell, is the ESY publication. And the next document that I want to go over is the one titled Handout 2, Implementing ESY Processes. So please have that pulled up and ready to look at, and I will pull it up on my computer. So it looks like this, Implementing ESY Processes in Your District. So we'll go over these key questions, and I'll kind of talk about a view from which to, or a lens from which to view these different key questions. This document and the last one that we'll go over are not official special education forms. The purpose of these last two documents is simply to give you information to consider regarding your ESY processes. So the first one, what time frame will your IEP teams use as a basis for determining if there's an issue with regression and recoupment? So in other words, at what point does a lapse in recoupment become a consideration for ESY eligibility? If this isn't something that you discuss with the teachers in your district and the teams in your district, you'll likely have different IEP teams working from a different frame of reference, which means that you could have a student in one building who takes 10 days to recoup after the winter break and is found to be eligible for ESY, and a student in another building who it takes 20 days to recoup after the winter break, and they do not find that student eligible. So there's always going to be exceptions, and there's always outliers, and there's certainly a lot of things to consider with regard to whether or not a child is eligible for extended school year, but having a common understanding can help tremendously when you're looking at these time frames. And related to that, the next key question is, how many days of data collection will you expect before breaks in education? This also comes back to consistency. if one team collects progress monitoring data for 9 days before the breaks, and then another team collects data for 5 days, your IEP teams may not be making eligibility decisions based on the same criteria. And unfortunately, there is no time frame in the regulations that says you must collect progress monitoring data for this amount of days before a break in education to determine regression and recoupment. The next question is, with regard to data collection before breaks in education, will your IEP teams use maximum, minimum, median, average, or actual data point scores? And this speaks to those details that you'll want to think about ahead of time. And I want to explain it just through an example because it'll make more sense. So if a child has a measurable annual goal for oral reading fluency, the teachers may collect data for 9 days before the Thanksgiving break or the winter holiday break. And you all know as well as I do that when you're collecting progress monitoring data, from day to day, that data point from the student is going to vary. And so I bring up this example because it actually happened to me. I assumed that all of the teachers were collecting data for 9 days prior to the break, which they were, but some of the teachers were using an average of those scores from that 9-day period, which is what I wanted them to do, and other teachers, just pockets of them, were just using the last data point. So if we have a situation where the day before the break, the student scores 55 words correct per minute, that's the point that we want to get back to after break. So if they had 55 words correct per minute, when we return from the break, we'll be collecting data, and we want them to get back to 55 words correct per minute. So if they come back and their score is 40 words correct per minute, that definitely shows regression. But if then the next day they get back to 55 words correct per minute, there's really not a recoupment issue, because while there was regression, they recouped it right away. And so I had to meet with all of the teachers in my district to make sure that we were using an average. You don't have to use an average, but that's what we used to make sure that variability in the data points wasn't kind of hindering our decisions on the regression and recoupment. The next question to consider is, when must IEP teams submit their data collection for your review? So is there a need in your district or charter school for checking in points in the year so you know if teams are collecting data appropriately? For example, my team submitted their data to me 3 weeks after Thanksgiving and then 5 weeks after the winter break. And this just allowed me to check the pulse of what was happening and to determine if I needed to provide any further instruction or professional development. The next key question to consider is, when must IEP teams inform you of eligibility determinations based upon data collection? If you're a very small school or small district, this may not be an issue. If you are a medium to large size school district, it may become an issue. So you may want to consider eligibility determination submission for students in the Armstrong-Klein group as well as students who are not. So for students who are in the Armstrong-Klein group, for example, my team submitted data to me by the end of January so that I could ensure they were revising IEPs as necessary by the February 28th due date, and so there was time for the NOREP prior written notices to be issued by March 31st. So then for students with IEPs who are not in the Armstrong group, there's no legally mandated date for this, but you'll need to know which students are eligible in order to plan how to actually implement ESY programming. So it would definitely help to know and think of this in advance. The next key question is, what guidance will you provide IEP teams for determining how many hours of ESY an eligible student should receive? There's nothing in the regulations that say, for example, if it takes a student 4 weeks to recoup skills after the winter break, that shall equal 10 hours of extended school year. So while there are always outliers and each student's circumstances are different, it may help to discuss, or at least have in mind ahead of time, a general guideline for how to assign how much time for ESY the eligible students should receive. Next key question, how and when will you expect communication to occur with families regarding extended school year? My teams reached out to parents early in the year to let them know that they would be collecting data before and after breaks to collect data regarding extended school year determination. And also they reached out to the families of eligible students in early February to discuss the IEP revisions if needed, and just to make sure everybody was still in agreement, and to find out if the parents were indeed planning to send their child to ESY. The next question, how and when will you expect communication from representatives of outside placements regarding the ESY eligibility of your students at those placements? Remember that the IEP review meeting must occur no later than February 28th, and a NOREP prior written notice issued by March 31st for students in the Armstrong-Klein group. Personnel from outside placements may or may not know this, but the LEA, you are still responsible to ensure that it occurs, so you may not want to wait and assume that the required elements are occurring. Also, the outside placements with which you collaborate may have misunderstandings regarding ESY eligibility criteria. And if that's the case, then it definitely may be helpful to touch base with them regarding all eligibility criteria. Next key question, will you be providing ESY in-house through a contract with another agency or through some other means? Regardless of how you'll provide ESY, it'll take some planning. If you're providing it through a contracted service like your local IU or another agency, there's a good chance that they'll require the student IEPs by a certain date, and that date may require some of the timelines we've already discussed to change. If you're providing it in-house, there's a number of things that you'll need to decide on, and probably the earlier the better. So for example, at which buildings and which rooms will you be providing ESY? Who will be providing that instruction? And depending on your LEA, these may lead to other tasks, like if you have your own teachers providing ESY, do you need to post those ESY instruction positions? Will you need to interview those interested teachers? Will you need nurses and paraprofessionals for ESY? How many buses or vans will be needed? And the second to last question, when will you begin the discussion of logistics with other necessary parties, such as the business office, transportation department, and the human resources department? Some of this goes along with the previous question regarding whether you have to speak to HR. Otherwise, you may need to speak to your director of buildings and grounds to ensure that the building and the classrooms are clean and available. Over the summers, when a lot of HVAC projects occur, that's when they're stripping and waxing the floor. So the earlier that your director of buildings and grounds knows which building and which rooms you want to use, the better it will be. And you also may need to talk to transportation to ensure that drivers and vehicles will be ready, and that the drivers and families are aware of pickup and drop-off times. If you'll be using technology during ESY, you'll probably need to touch base with your IT director just to make sure that all of those devices are there and in working order for ESY. And then the final consideration here is, how will you ensure IEP teams are considering factors other than regression and recoupment? And the point of this question is because if you're talking a lot throughout the school year about data collection for regression and recoupment, sometimes the teachers may focus so much on the data for regression and recoupment that they may forget that there are other factors that need to be considered as well. So do you need to build in reminders into the school year to make sure that folks are remembering they need to consider those other factors other than regression and recoupment? And then the final thing I want to say before we move to the final handout is regarding outside or contracted ESY service providers. If you are considering this, just be aware that you may want to ask them some key questions about how they plan to address the measurable annual goals that are the focus of extended school year, what kind of data collection will they be doing, and also be aware, if you've been in the position of a special education leader more than just this year, you know that towards the spring, a lot of outside agencies and various places start sending out flyers and advertisements to families about ESY services that they provide or camps that they provide. And a lot of times it'll have a little sticker that'll say ESY eligible. And so know in advance that places are seeking students to come to their camps or their ESY services, and knowing that that's going to happen, it's always a good idea to make sure you have all of your data and information in line. And that should just about do it for this handout. The next third and final handout that we'll go over. And again, remember that these are just resources. These are not things that are required. These are just things that you'll want to consider as you're revamping or relooking at your extended school year processes. This handout actually has a lot of the same or similar information as the last handout that we just went over. It's just mapped out by month of when you might want to look at it. But some of the information is different, and that's what I'll go over. And remember, all of this is just for consideration. So in October, you may want to consider sending a roster or data collection form to all of your special education teachers. And if you decide to do something like this, it could be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet that has them list the students who are on their roster, if the student's disability puts them into the Armstrong-Klein group, if there's a concern about possibly needing ESY, either because of their disability, because they've received it in the past, or because they have a really low rate of acquisition, and then a place for them to list the goals that they're going to monitor for ESY so that they can, throughout the school year, collect that data and put it into the document. And this brought home the point that I expected data collection to occur and that they would need to submit this data to me at various points in the year. Most do this anyway, but some folks may need the added accountability or a reminder to ensure that ESY eligibility decisions are being made based on data. And then establish a criteria for what constitutes regression and recoupment concerns. We already talked about this, and this can be really helpful to establish early in the year so that as the IEP meetings occur, this can be discussed. And then also a consideration for October is to establish your expectations with special education teachers regarding data collection and due dates and ensure that they understand the eligibility criteria. Depending on the size of your special education department, you may or may not want to do this or need to do this. However, I've found that the clearer you are with the expectations and accountability early on, the more likely it is that folks will go through the process appropriately in order to make good decisions on eligibility. Because of the dates regarding Armstrong-Klein being February 28th for the IEP review meeting and March 31st for the NOREP prior written notice, you may decide to have different due dates for students who are in this group versus ones who are not. Early on, I used 2 sets of due dates, but as time went on, I decided to use the same due dates for students who are in the Armstrong-Klein group as well as those who are not. And it was just cleaner for me personally, just because for the most part, the teams were making those determinations at the same time anyway. And I always just made sure they understood that if an eligibility determination was made after the due date for a child who was not in the Armstrong-Klein group because of other factors, that they just had to contact me directly as soon as that decision was made. Things to consider for November. You may want to remind teachers to collect data for however many days are decided prior to the Thanksgiving break and when the students return after Thanksgiving break. And we talked about this earlier, but whatever's determined, you want to be sure that the teams are aware of it before the Thanksgiving break. And then begin planning how you will provide ESY for eligible students and set dates for planning. And I know that at this point it's only November, but it really is helpful to have a plan for how you're going to provide ESY earlier rather than later. And that being said, you may also want to consider securing locations and staff if you're providing ESY services in-house. Again, depending on the size of your district and location, this may or not be critical at this time of year. I was in a district where a lot of things were going on over the summer, both the district things and things happening that were sponsored by the community. So I really needed to reserve space early on. And then finally for November, to consider ensuring that teachers understand they'll need to collect data before and after the winter holiday break and know when you expect final eligibility determinations from the IEP teams. I'm a little compulsive when it comes to the data collection, so I would make sure to remind them to collect the data before Thanksgiving and then again before the winter holiday break, and I sent that reminder in November and early in December. Some folks need the reminders and some don't, but I really don't like surprises, so I erred on the side of maybe too many reminders, but just something to consider. In December, remind IEP teams regarding data collection before and after the winter holiday break if that's needed, and consider communication with representatives of the outside placement at which you have students placed regarding eligibility criteria, communication with families, and general due dates. And I spoke to this earlier, but I will say that reaching out to outside placements regarding ESY was very helpful, just making sure we're on the same page with the eligibility criteria and having those IEP review meetings for the students who were eligible. The outside placements have students from many different LEAs, all of which probably do things just a little differently, so it does help to touch base with them regarding your expectations for the students in your LEA. Things to consider for January, just reminder for the due date for final determinations and any expected family communication, and a reminder that they need to consider all required factors, not only regression and recoupment. Considerations for February, ensure that all determinations for students who fall in the Armstrong-Klein group are made no later than February 28th, and follow up with any IEP teams that are undecided on whether a student is eligible or not. Now, if you have the ESY data sent to you and have ongoing communication about ESY throughout the school year, you'll know when teams really aren't sure if a student is eligible or not, and so you'll have time then to meet with the case manager and or the principal to go over the data and any other relevant information to make final determinations. Things to consider for March, you may want to look at beginning to finalize plans for how extended school year will be provided. Inevitably, the best laid plans sometimes encounter hiccups, and so I would use March as my time to seek out those hiccups. And a lot of times might have been something with the building that was being used. Is there some kind of a project occurring in that building that wasn't known whenever I first reserved the building or the rooms? Is there a potential issue with the equipment that's going to be needed, with technology? It's just kind of a time to look at what could possibly go wrong and try and remediate any of those things. And then in April, you may want to consider sitting down and meeting with your transportation department regarding extended school year. At this time of year in April, you'll know which students are receiving extended school year and where, and it may be a good time to just sit down with your transportation director to go over each student who's going to need transportation for extended school year. And for example, you may have students with behaviors and the driver needs special instructions. You may have students who have special equipment needs for being transported. So meeting around this time of year helps ensure that the drivers get all of the information they need for transportation to go as smoothly as possible. You also may have situations where you really want to try and get a student's driver from during the school year to be their driver during extended school year, and that could be because maybe they just have a great connection and they get along well, or you may have a student who a change like a new driver and new expectations would just throw them off. And so thinking about each student individually with regard to transportation at this time of year can really kind of help negotiate some of those potential issues that may occur if you don't kind of give it some thought at this time. And then for May, just making final preparations and getting ready for ESY to occur. That is all we have for the publication and the two handouts. And at this time, I'm going to mute for about a minute or two and look at any of the questions that have been posted, and then I'll come back to address any of those questions. All right, and it appears that we have no unanswered questions out there, so that will conclude our webinar, our coffee break for today. And I'm going to stay on for a little bit just in case any questions are thought of. And please know that this is being recorded so we can post it in the near future. And if you have any questions moving forward, feel free to contact me at ccrouch@patent.net. And we do have one question here. What other considerations other than regression, recoupment, and updated medical information should the team be considering for ESY eligibility? And if you look in your extended school year publication, it will list all of those other factors that need to be considered. And let me find it. But you would want to consider things like, is the student at a point of being able to master a very important skill? Is the student at a point where they may be ready to achieve self-sufficiency and independence from caretakers, and the break in education would throw them back so far that it's better to provide it over the summer so that the student doesn't lose all of the skills that they're working on. The extent to which successive interruptions in educational programming and the cumulative loss of skills and knowledge during those interruptions would make the student become so frustrated, lost, or confused that they withdraw from the learning process. And then also you want to consider the severity of the disability. And so if you look in the publication on pages 10 and 11, that was our first handout, those are all of the factors that need to be considered for eligibility. Okay, and another question that came up in the chat was, how do you determine how many goals to select for extended school year from the IEP? And that really is going to be on a case-by-case basis. So if you've been collecting data throughout the school year and you see that the student is eligible in, could be one measurable annual goal, it could be 5 or 6, whatever you're seeing that they are showing issues with regression and recoupment, or if it would fall into one of the categories of the other factors to consider, whatever the data is telling you, that's how many measurable annual goals you would want to address during extended school year. And then another question just came up. What criteria do you recommend for a period of time for recoupment to qualify for extended school year services? And I don't know that I would have an answer for that. I know that what I did in my district, and what I did in my district was, if a student was able to recoup within 5 days after the Thanksgiving break, then we would just kind of keep an eye on how that student recouped after the winter holiday break. And the winter holiday break, anywhere between 7 to 10 days upon returning, we would have a discussion about whether or not that would fall into the eligibility criteria. I can't really recommend a hard and fast period of time for you to consider, but if you look at what the other students, the students who don't have IEPs, what kind of regression and or recoupment they may or may not have, that might help you determine in your district or your charter school what would be an appropriate period of time to consider. And there's another question here. ESY eligibility is determined by February 28 on the goals the student is working on at that time. If goals should change, do they need to follow those goals? And does anything new need to be done to follow those goals? What happens to the new goals? So I'm not sure I completely understand the question. So what I believe is, if a student has an IEP with certain measurable annual goals, there's a decision that's made by February 28th if they fall into the Armstrong-Klein group, which means that they have a disability diagnosis of emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, or autism. And then maybe there's an IEP meeting after February 28th and those goals change. I would have that discussion as an IEP team if the goal has changed, but most likely if you made the determination that a goal was requiring extended school year by the February 28th deadline, then that would apply even if the goal changed. And if they were eligible before or by February 28th and then the goal changed, I would imagine that it wouldn't change substantially if it was determined that there was a need for extended school year. Can the district determine that a student within the, I'm not sure, I don't understand that question. Can the district determine that a student within the Armstrong group is not in need of ESY? Absolutely. A student in the Armstrong-Klein group, which means that they have a diagnosis of intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, or autism, isn't just because of the diagnosis eligible for extended school year. You would want to look at, that would be one factor for sure, but then you would want to look at the other factors as well to determine if they are eligible for extended school year. Okay, it looks like we've got all of the questions in, and if any additional ones continue to trickle in, I will compile those questions and we can post it with the handouts. So that will do it for our coffee break for today, and I'm going to sign off and thank you very much and happy Monday.